Hello, I'm Meia Nouwens, and welcome to a special two-part episode of Sound Strategic on the U.S. presidential election. Following the news that Joe Biden has been elected the 46th President of the United States, we wanted to take this opportunity to talk to regional experts from across the IISS for their thoughts on what this new administration will mean for American foreign policy over the next 4 years. In this episode, we look at how regional leaders in the Asia-Pacific and Middle East have reacted to the election news and the possible policy changes the Biden administration could bring to the two regions. Over the past 4 years, China has emerged as the United States' biggest systemic and strategic rival on the world stage. Euan Graham, the IISS Shangri-La Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security, sees several key points of continuity in the U.S. policy towards the region between the Biden and Trump administrations, despite their political differences. Welcome onto the show, Euan. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
So what has been the reaction of leaders in the Asia-Pacific to Biden's election victory?
Well, so far we've had a near unanimous chorus amongst the democracies, at least, welcoming a Biden victory. A stony silence from Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow. So read into that what you will. But I think the Asia-Pacific has endorsed the Biden victory by and large.
So the Asia-Pacific has become a major focus of American foreign policy in recent years as part of American efforts to contain China's influence in the region. Do you think there will be a major change in U.S. foreign policy under a Biden presidency? And what are the issues do you think that the new administration will prioritize?
I think it's very difficult for the Biden administration to say outright that there will be continuity from the Trump administration for obvious political reasons. But I think the reality is that at least in the policy, if not in the implementation, there will be significant commonality over what the administration has done over the last 4 years. And I emphasize administration because the president obviously was a wild card within that. But I think the bipartisanship that is regularly commented on in Washington is a significant factor. And in political terms, it makes no sense for Biden to risk looking soft on China, domestically. So I think that will also tend to corral policy, I think, in the new administration, more towards a continuity theme rather than discontinuity, with some significant exemptions. And that includes a much greater tilt towards allies. That's one obvious difference in I think the president-elect and his emphasis on the importance of acting multilaterally, but with allies in particular, and with Donald Trump. So in that sense, it will be welcomed, I think, amongst the US allies and its close partners who have maintained, I think, a sometimes through gritted teeth, commitment to the alliance in the United States, regardless of the incumbent in the White House. But now I think there will be a genuine good feeling that the United States is willing to commit to its alliances, both in word and in deed. However, I think there is also significant structural headwinds against whoever the winner of the recent election is. And Biden will also have to contend with the fact that the United States is facing an uphill struggle in all parts of the Indo-Pacific, but in Southeast Asia in particular. And that's not just because of the spotty record of the Trump administration in regional engagement. It's really to do with the changing balance of power, with China front and center of that. It's not the only factor. We have North Korea, which may come front and center in the near term, but China is obviously the long-term strategic challenge for the United States. And that's going to apply regardless of whether it's Democrat or Republican in the White House.
So, what will different countries in the region be looking for from a Biden administration? You already mentioned how allies will be looking for greater reinforcement and support of the alliance system and alliance structures. Um, what about countries in Southeast Asia? What will they look to a Biden administration for?
Well, Southeast Asia sits at the geographical center of the Indo-Pacific, and therefore it does deserve extra attention. But it's a slippery target into the bargain. 10 very different countries with very little in common other than their united interest in not being dominated or turned into proxies for a great power conflict. That was the motivation throughout the last 50 years. During the Cold War, we've seen a change of major power players, but the same logic applies. For Southeast Asia, I think it's very difficult for the United States to be a symmetrical competitor to China because it cannot compete with China's economic pull or its strategic proximity. Therefore, for the United States to restore its position, it must grasp the nettle that to do so means really to act in combination with other like-minded major powers within the sub-region and outside. Australia, India, and Japan are the obvious ones, and in the formulation of the Quad, I think that's what the Quad really means. It's a tacit recognition that the United States is not the hegemon of old. It can only really offer something to Southeast Asia in combination. But if it does so, and does so smartly under Biden, it can still be, I think, a more formidable player than it was under Trump because of Trump's unilateralist and exceptionalist tendencies. If the United States is willing to go down the line of least resistance, if you like, and engage with the bilateral partnerships that are most amenable within Southeast Asia, Vietnam is one obvious example, but there are others, then I think it could do well to make up lost ground and combine with the comparative advantage of the others. India has an obvious advantage in terms of scale. Australia brings competences and knowledge of the region, which may be lacking in Washington. And Japan has very significant economic and security stake in Southeast Asia. But that needs to be joined up, I think, in a more concerted fashion. And we saw the Trump administration actually belatedly recognizing that logic with its embrace of the Quad. I don't think the Quad is a silver bullet solution either. There's going to be no easy way to turn this around for the United States in Southeast Asia, but it needs to have more inducements and less focus, I think, on ideology and on the stick of sanctions and rhetoric. It needs to also basically, frankly, bring its checkbook to the party and be prepared to economically re-engage with Southeast Asia.
At the moment, the United States faces significant challenges at home, whilst Biden has also made it clear that he wants to return the U.S. to a path that is more respected by its international partners and allies. Is there concern in the region that the U.S. for the next few years will be more consumed by their domestic agenda and their domestic issues rather than their foreign policy?
I think that's an ongoing and perfectly well substantiated concern in the region because the United States will remain a divided polity. The election result speaks for itself. It wasn't in the end the narrowest of victories, but still it was a clearly split result. And that will have foreign policy implications. Biden's instincts are to repair the United States at home. I think his approach to great power competition is the United States needs to get its own economic house in order first, and that competition will proceed from that assumption. The difficulty in that is that the region, and particularly America's adversaries will not allow Washington that breathing space, and that in any vacuum there will be a temptation to move on China or North Korea's part. Perhaps not in an overly dramatic way, but nonetheless, I think the record of the last several years shows that China has been very expert at undermining the credibility of the United States below the threshold at which the United States is willing to commit force. And the Biden administration may well face its own test rather quickly in that. I think there is plenty of pull on the rope still within the region for a more energized and committed United States, and I think a substantial amount of goodwill, but that has to be tempered by a modified power calculation that the United States and Biden is inheriting a ravaged economy that will take some time to revive, and I think the politics will probably point the other way from a narrow focus on defense and resources for defense. The hope is, I think, that the Biden administration, if it realizes that China is as big a priority as it is, there will be a kind of global balancing adjustment from other theaters, particularly in the Middle East, but also Europe, where the United States, frankly, does not need to be the leading player, but strategically the center of global gravity is in this region. And I think that there's no easy answer for that. It will require a great deal of political will and the investment of political energy and treasure to make sure that the United States maintains its competitiveness in the military, economic and diplomatic full spectrum competition with China. We don't know the answer to that. I think the region is waiting for the first appointments as a sign of the Biden administration's interest in the region. And I don't think it should be recast in terms of a pivot to or any throwback to the Obama era, for which, frankly, there's zero nostalgia in the region. That's the big albatross around Biden's neck, is that he obviously he represents continuity from the Obama administration. The challenge for him is to present continuity from the Trump administration in a way that he can politically get away with. But we are in a different world from that which existed in 2016.
And maybe a last question. If you were sitting in Beijing, what would be going through your mind right now?
Well, if I was Xi Jinping, I would obviously be aware of a historic opportunity on one hand, and that we know that the recent conclave of the party which basically agreed to the proposition that the United States is in secular decline, and that China has the winds in its sails in historical terms. But he's not a Mao. He's, in that sense, a very different kind of Chinese leader, and more cautious, I think. Therefore, I think the proposition of a full-scale move on Taiwan, I think, is probably very low in the short term. A very different proposition over the next couple of years, I might add. But I think that he will probably be tempted to make some kind of move to test the United States will, but it may not be the black and white move that we fear the most. If any country in the region is likely to test the United States in the short term, it might be North Korea, which has a proxy value for China in any case. So some of that is outside of the control of the great powers and very difficult to predict. Taiwan, I think, is going to be the biggest and most obvious challenge, because that's the one which Xi Jinping has rhetorically nailed his colours to the mast on, with reunification of China. And it's the one in which the United States has the least wiggle room. Its credibility is on the line. And I think that's the obvious flashpoint. On the other hand, I think there are many ways for China to exert pressure on Taiwan short of a full-scale and amphibious assault, which would be extremely risky. With all of the political disarray in the United States military still remains a force to be reckoned with in the region. And it's proved that, I think, with its sustained presence, despite some early difficulties with the US Navy during the pandemic. It has since rallied and maintained a strong deterrent posture. And I think that Xi Jinping will be mindful of that. But there are other ways to skin the cat. And I think that there could be indirect moves on Taiwan in the South China Sea through some of its outlying territory there, or a blockade perhaps at the upper end of the scale. But it is certain to come on Biden's agenda sooner than he would like. And I think the idea that the United States has an interregnum in which it can rebuild its economy and then leisurely resume great power competition from a position of strength is a nice idea, but in practice, it's very unlikely to be sustained because one's adversaries have a vote, even if they're not democracies. And China is going to be, I think, chipping away at the margins of US credibility, especially in this short-term period before we do get a transition. And I think that was always going to be the case. That's the most predictable challenge that one can have. I think the bigger challenge for the United States is to realize that it is no longer a symmetrical competitor of China in the heart of the region. That requires a mental adjustment, not just on the part of Biden and his administration, but the American people, that they are no longer a global hegemon that's able to compete across regions in the way that they were in the post-war period. It's going to require an almighty concentration of resources, but it's also going to require a shift of resources from other parts of the world.
Well, lots to watch for the next 4 years. Euan, thank you for joining us.
My great pleasure.
A new Biden administration could represent a sea change in U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East. But as IISS Senior Adviser Raine explains, the politics of the region will still require engagement from President-elect Biden, but perhaps of a different nature and focus than that of his predecessor. Hello, John, and welcome back to another episode of Sound Strategic.
Hi, Meia. Nice to be back.
So the Middle East has been one of the regions where the Trump administration has been most engaged with over the last 4 years. And Trump has developed personal relationships with several regional leaders, including Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. How do you think these leaders will now view a Biden presidency?
Well, first of all, that they are faced with both a very different proposition. Biden and his administration are going to pursue, they've already signaled this, very different kinds of policies. But they're also presented with someone they know, because Biden has been actively involved in several previous incarnations in the Middle East. They know him and he knows them. Where I think we will see the big change, though, is that the nature of the relationship between the US president and Middle East leaders is going to change. And I think it will move onto a more regular basis. So a lot of the language that President-elect Biden has used has indicated that he's not going to be in the business of doing favors for favors. He's not going to have sort of sweetheart relationships with guys he just happens to get along with. He's going to have principles, policy objectives from which policy is derived. So I guess the way they will be looking at it is that here's somebody we know. This is not going to be straightforward, but he's somebody that we can do business with. At one end of the spectrum, however, of kind of Middle East leaders, I think a lot will be nervous about the moral language that President-elect Biden has used, and they will be nervous about how that translates into both the way he deals with them personally and the way he designs his policies.
And what does that spectrum look like? Do you think there are any leaders in the Middle East that are looking particularly favorably at the Biden administration and what that might mean for them?
He has a long-standing relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, and Netanyahu was quick to congratulate him. I think, as far as Netanyahu and the Israelis are concerned, Biden, he's a long-standing supporter. He has characterized himself as such over the decades. And he's someone I think they would feel comfortable doing business with, but the same caveats apply as I mentioned earlier. There'll be elements in his policy which could be tricky. However, there'll be a lot to reassure. He hasn't shown himself as yet determined to reverse some of the more spectacular elements of Trump's policy, particularly the move of the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So I think at that end of the spectrum, you've got people for whom Biden's not going to be straightforward, but they know him, they've got pre-existing relationships. I think trickier for leaders like Mohammed bin Salman, the effective leader of Saudi Arabia, who has been almost a personal target for some of President Biden's comments, highly critical comments. And I think he has used a kind of diplomatic code when he has talked about reassessing the relationship with Saudi Arabia. What he's looking at here is it's the style in which Saudi has been operating and the style in which MBS has led his country, as well as some of the substantive actions. But overall, there you can see that there is going to be a tension, and there's going to have to be a recalibration on both sides. I mean, there are a lot of leaders in between. I'd single out, Mohammed bin Zayed, effective leader of the UAE, who moved very quickly to congratulate Biden, and who has, I think, positioned himself quite well to establish a strong working relationship. Obviously, there's quite a bit of stake there. The Americans have just agreed the sale of the outgoing administration just agreed the sale of the F-35s to the UAE. So maybe there's something on the table which the Emiratis don't want to see go off the table. But I think more broadly than that, the UAE is looking to under MBZ to continue, if you like, the institutional elements in the relationship with the Americans. So they're kind of in the middle. So it's a spectrum. But for everybody, while in the long term, the Biden administration is probably a good thing for the Middle East. It's not an easy thing for them.
So what type of major changes in the U.S. approach to the Middle East under Biden can we expect? You already talked about this moral language that Biden has talked about in his speeches and his comments about the region, but also I think just more globally in the U.S.'s foreign policy. What other major changes can we expect?
Okay, well, I think the Middle East is going to be a test bed for a number of features of the Biden administration's policy. And the first one of those is multilateralism. So, how many of the issues in the Middle East, Libya, Syria, even possibly the war in Yemen, how many of these is the administration going to try to solve through active engagement with multilateralism to revive multilateral efforts to support them? Or how much is it going to leave to local powers, or indeed, in some cases, to just leaving space for other foreign powers to intervene? So I guess that's the first thing. It's that shift in multilateralism. The regime is the administration will be under real pressure to show that it means that, and it's going to have to do that first of all, I think, in the Middle East. The second one is sort of moral tolerances. So if it is going to have new moral tolerances, then the Middle East is where these come to the surface most quickly. I don't think the administration will have the luxury of dealing, as it were, with the in-tray and then getting around to the big issues, the kind of shaping of the new global order later. It's all going to arrive at the same time in the Middle East. And then I think the kind of third area where, we may see big changes where the administration will be tested is what style of US leadership have we got here? And the US have been the effective security guarantor for their partners in the region, particularly for the whole of the Gulf. So what does that translate into, presuming they want to continue that role? Will we see the same level of defense sales, of deployments to the region, the same level of diplomatic support, and the same levels of exchange of technology and capabilities? And I think on a lot of those, there will be similarities, but the ones I would signal out to watch, I think defense sales is going to be an area that is reassessed. I think deployments, we will see a continued reduction in the permanent presence of US military in the region, and a shift towards smarter, more remote ways of projecting force and supporting partners. But probably of all the issues in the region where we are likely to see most movement, I guess it is on Iran.
With regards to Iran, the U.S. has been very critical of its security concerns in the region. Will Biden, do you think, completely do away with Trump's maximum pressure campaign when it comes to Iran? And do you see any prospect, perhaps, of a renewal of the Iran nuclear deal or the U.S. rejoining JCPOA?
Well, of course, Biden has never liked maximum pressure. He described it as a dangerous failure. But when you look at the elements of maximum pressure, financial sanctions, a deterrent component to deployments, to diplomacy and rhetoric, both of those elements, I think, in some way are going to survive. And the reason for that is that levels of hostility towards Iran within the US administration, whatever its political complexion, are historically high. So I think the idea, if you're going to indulge the Iranians in the US, that's a large political gamble, and it's a kind of difficult one to pull off. There will be a lot of institutional opposition to that. The sanctions, don't forget, a lot of those sanctions relate to Iran's active involvement in terrorism, which has resulted in an almost record number of individuals and entities being put on the US sanctions list. So I think it's very hard to remove those. I think where we'll see the difference, though, is that Biden will be very keen to revive the deal with Iran because it's such a kind of iconic piece of multilateralism, because it was, while it ran, effective, and because when the US walked on it, it had such a resonance, such an adverse resonance for the US internationally as, trusted partner in treaties. So I think for those reasons, he's going to look for a way to get back in, but he will be conscious that he mustn't be seen to be indulging Iran, or, as it were, paying a re-entry price into JPOA. He's going to want something up front first. But I do think that ultimately we will see him back in some sort of treaty-based containment of Iran.
We saw a lot of movement on Israel during the Trump administration. There was a establishment of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, but we've also seen the U.S. broker normalized ties between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and a few other countries. What do you think the Israeli-U.S. relationship is going to look going forward under a Biden administration?
There is a strong personal relationship between the two leaders at the moment, which will set the tone for that relationship. So I don't, neither side is wanting a confrontational relationship. The big difference is going to be the P word, and discussion of Palestine and Palestinians was noticeably absent, or just relegated to footnotes in the Kushner plan, everything else that Trump tried to achieve in the Middle East. So I think we're going to find that the Palestinians are back as a specific agenda item. And that's something, of course, that the Palestinians have been calling for. They are very, very cautious in their optimism about this. They don't want to get their hopes up. They know how let down they have been by previous administrations. But just looking at the way in which Biden and his administration want to approach international disputes, which is very much to get the inclusive and the enduring solution to them, however hard it's going to be, I think he's still going to try to apply that to the Palestinian problem. And I think with reference to Trump's achievements in the Middle East, so the Abraham Accord and then the deals with Bahrain and Sudan, these are good things to have, and that's something on which Biden can work. I think that it was probably a consideration for all those parties that they wanted to conclude those deals, all the Arab partners, with a view to ensuring they have the best start with Joe Biden as well. So I think that might be something on which people can build. The thing that was missing conspicuously was that the normalization with Israel did not bring any material benefit, and many have argued disbenefits to the Palestinians. And I think that's something that Joe Biden is going to want to change.
Now, lastly, there are still several ongoing conflicts throughout the Middle East in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. Is there potential for the new administration to have a positive impact in resolving these conflicts?
There is potential. The question is, what's the appetite and the capacity in the administration? And sadly, the number of conflicts in the Middle East exceeds the capacity of almost any external actor to become invested in all of them with a view to sticking the course to solve them. So I think what will happen is that there'll be a certain amount of triage in the Biden camp. Iran, you've got to do. Saudi, Yemen, you've got to do, because that's part of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Then I think you get on to Syria and Iraq in sort of the next category. In Iraq, I think that the drawdown or the consolidation of the US presidency, I think that will continue. And in Syria, we will probably see a renewed US attempt to increase the multilateral pressure through sanctions, so on and so forth, on Bashar al-Assad. And then you get on to conflicts, Libya primarily, where, US involvement hitherto has been strictly limited. And my hunch is that the Biden administration is going to want to put that in the category of things which are best solved through multilateralism, and where there's a chance for the US to show its support for multilateralism by kind of backing that process. I think the thing that we won't see in any of these conflicts is direct US intervention. There is skepticism, at least in the Biden camp, about the value of direct military intervention, even though Joe Biden was, as we've all been remembered, he's a supporter of American intervention. First time around in Iraq, he's very much changed his view on that. He's learned a lesson a lot of people have learned, is that in the long run, that kind of direct intervention can be counterproductive. But where I guess I'll qualify that finally is that the US's pursuit of remote warfare, primarily through drones against carefully selected targets, I think that will continue. That's something that has proved to be very much bipartisan, and as we know, it was actually under a Democratic government that the numbers of those strikes went up rather than down.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, John, and we look forward to talking to you more on these topics in the coming months ahead.
Thanks, my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed part 1 of our special U.S. election episode. Join us again soon for part 2, where we will be discussing the new Biden administration policy priorities in Russia and Latin America. So don't forget to follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And for all the latest analysis of international conflict, security, and defense issues, remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or visit the IISS website. Thank you, and see you next time.